As I already mentioned that before the break, I'm filled with questions and comments, and I'm sure you are as well. There was a certain logic to me that I prepared even prior to the presentations, but now reality has intervened and created a different scenario. And I would like to start with a question about to the last speaker, to Yevhen Hlibovytsky. Lee McIntyre, the author of the book on post-truth, wrote about people being more inclined to trust their own beliefs, what they already believe, than proven facts. And he describes, for instance, the victory of Donald Trump in the United States that was a shock for many Americans, and I think for most of the world as well. Or, for example, if we look at the Ukrainian reality with the current president who for whom was kind of the perfect image created in a film as a kind of simple man imbued with authority and creating, a world of good, kind of putting things to right and existing with this utopian justice. People seem to be capable to believe, more inclined to believe their own beliefs, what they already believe, than reality or established facts. Would you say this is our reality now and in the future? Or do we live in a world of populism and there are no alternative stories? How would you explain this? Poor translators. I mean, so I'll be talking about things that are not translatable into English. So, I mean, the translators can give you a hint if it's. They're doing that now. I'm afraid it's more of an existential issue. Throw something in the glass if we're getting too out of hand. To those who had lived here in the past 30 years, especially the older you get, this situation in the West is very understandable. Yevhen Hlibovytsky, the Ukrainian sociologist, once had me as a guest in his house, and he gave me. He whipped out these notes from 1990 from Kyiv. What people were asking from focus group discussions in the early 90s. What were people asking? People were asking, can you buy groceries in a private shop? Is it safe? Because who the hell knows? I mean, it's all so shiny and attractive, but maybe there's some poison in there, or who knows? Or do market relations, are they applicable to personal relations? For instance, can you stimulate friendship financially? The level of lack of adaptation, of social maladaptation, was unreal. This helps us understand now what path we have made from one system to the other. In Galicia, for instance, or in the Baltic states, it was easier because they had their grandparents were still living and they still remembered that model and they could do something. But otherwise, in other situations, it was simply a huge social experiment that went so deep, went so far that there was no alternative model in historical memory simply to resort to. So now let's look at perhaps this most difficult, most challenging element of this transformation, this understanding of how marketing works. because marketing from the point of view of a Soviet person is something profoundly dishonest. You have a product, it has its advantage, it has pros and cons, but when you're selling it, you're only talking about the pros. I mean, that's not fair. Buy our delicious bread, with its crust, but it doesn't say what it's like inside, or that it will tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, it will become really hard, or it will mold. And so the question, the understanding of where this line is, it's subtle, and it can't be written down in a rule, right? At the point when this kind of clear, again, historically motivated reality of United States began to fall apart, people started believing not what was rational, because the rational was too complicated. It was too difficult to explain how innovation in India brought to a Southern Korean company making something that led to changes in the market in the States, which is why you in the States have lost your jobs that you had for 4 decades. And in a moment when you're most vulnerable, just before you're about to retire, you've lost your job and you have no opportunity to find another one. And a city with 1 million people, suddenly half of the population leaves. And so as a result of this, the only option that is clear, that is understandable, is empathy. So you can't reach those who this difficult reality. You only, and so suddenly Trump shows up. Who touches these strings. He says nothing that is legally pursuable, but everybody understood something. White people, men, this will be your country again, right? Here's your alpha path, whatever, etc., etc., etc. As a result, an upheaval happens. An identical upheaval was recommended for representatives of the Soviet generations by Paul Manafort, who actually designed Trump later. He designed another famous actor that we know, right, in Eastern Europe, and he proposed those same sentiments for Yanukovych, and Yanukovych tried that same game, tried his hand at that same game about how, there's this horrible Ukrainization, this horrible persecution of Russian speakers, that, I mean, how were we lucky? We were lucky that Soviet identity started falling apart. It no longer existed in the wild, except for the Donbass. And so these attempts simply shattered on the impossibility of their implementation. And later on, Zelensky, as a follower in the footsteps of the same logic, he found access to those strings. And we, in a country who never votes in majority, who always elects with a plurality, all of our presidents have been elected in plurality. Suddenly gives them 73%, a majority, a landslide. Such a powerful mandate that this mandate, with talent, Zelensky could have built his own autocracy here. It's situational, yes, but its monolith is what Pete Schmigel was talking about. The Australian American psychologist who was building the veterans rehabilitation structure. Trauma is not in some groups of Ukrainian society. Trauma is in the entire society. And so, because trauma is so widespread, those who propose ways that and means to help, suddenly, everybody wants to be a client. Everybody wants some of it. Both with Zelensky and with Yulia. Just Yulia didn't know what she was doing. And people who found, their home in the alternative to Trump, in this project, alternative to Trump, I mean, it's they only didn't fall for it because they were already enamored of the other project. We have three such projects. We have the Russian project, the Poroshenko, and the Zelensky that are in competition. And the field for rational discussion is as narrow as it was in the Soviet kitchens. And on this happy note, if any of you would like to respond or reflect, that. Um, and if not, then I'll continue with my questions. This again, this brings us. So this brings us back to. We have more questions than answers, but I think several times in several people we heard that this is completely normal, and it would be it's actually preferable to the opposite situation. But I'll continue then by asking, what is, I mean, in my head, I have following questions, subsequent questions of faith and trust and alternative scenarios in our society. We kept coming back to memory and to the fact that in our society, thanks to let's say in Galicia, there was some memory that we could work with that gave us some opportunities to survive, or we found ourselves face to face with a tradition that maybe stood in our way, but on the other hand also stimulated us to work. And so when I was thinking about questions, I wanted to address a question to Iryna Starovoit, who works with memory, because sometimes, I mean, we're always born in a particular family, and we get some heritage, some beliefs, and our parents or our family are what gives us some basic beliefs. And without these beliefs and trust in the family, it's not possible to. I mean, we all have these basic things, but then some time passes and we rethink them, or a point comes when we run into doubt and we rethink or we reject these things, these previous certainties. Sometimes there's this very unpleasant psychological sense called cognitive dissonance, when we encounter when what we believe is essentially not true, right? So what do we do with that heritage, both positive and negative? For instance, the negative legacy that Pan Yevhen mentioned, that we dealt with, and it seems that to this day many of us live with it and can't manage, or the positive legacy that we got. So I'll reflect briefly. First of all, thanks for taking this discussion into this plane as well. But of course, all of this complicates things yet further. So I would like to say right away that Pan Vakhtang already mentioned the situation of the development of this trust and this atmosphere of trust that obviously has started in Ukraine maybe in the last 5-7 years, and the peak of which was maybe the election of Zelensky. To me, this says that society had a resource of wanting to trust. Maybe it's a different question that somebody abused that, and trust can be deceived or abused. But it tells me that the resource of trust grew, at least at the point when those elections existed. Perhaps it also grew thanks to our common work, thanks to the fact that we have created these new coalitions. And the second and important thing, because we're moving in the plane of war versus security, we have to remind ourselves that this war is also a semantic war. And that at war, trust, especially trusting the enemy, is meaningless, is pointless. makes no sense. But I would like to return the question into the previous path, right? When in this discussion we talk more or less from the point of view of our experience and our circles, and this circle also emerged from the Soviet and post-Soviet reality. The post-Soviet reality of the 90s, yes, homo homini lupus est, and so this trust was not possible for many reasons, also because it was a zero-sum game. So if I win, you must lose. If you win, then I'm the loser. There is not enough resource for everyone, right? People lost their savings, people lost their qualifications, people lost the importance or need for their professions or their jobs. And what people are slightly seeing now because of technological modernization, this was the reality in the early 90s for the post-Soviet person. Another very important thing that occurred then was the construction of some kind of minimal social solidarity. For instance, in the post-Soviet republics, there was no resource to pay retirement to the citizens who spent their entire lives, working lives, in a country that no longer existed. The only thing that they could take on is that the people who are working and who are making money and paying taxes, that they will give some of their taxes for the retirement funds of these senior citizens. And we still have this system in place. But that means that my generation, for instance, if we don't educate the next several generations in the same thought, we will lose any chances. I think we've already lost it, yes, because the younger won't want to solidarize with us, and the same happens in the many illusory planes, right? This was seen by the last year. What happens with our healthcare? If we take all of this into account, then the question that Vakhtang came to, this homo homini lupus est, but not necessarily, it can reach a new level. Either a greater atmosphere of authentic trust, or a return to the illusion and imitation. Perhaps in Russian society in the early 2000s, there really was this return to the illusion and imitation of truth. There is some higher institution that decides what can or what cannot be shown on TV, what can be talked about and what must be controlled by guidelines and agendas. And these guidelines were infiltrating into our media space, but with these kind of temniki, right? These specific government enforced guidelines to how to report caused extreme upheaval in Ukraine, which of course ended up in a revolution in 2004, when in the presidential election one candidate was poisoned and the other one was not only demonstrably supported by the powers that be in Ukraine, but also the powers that be in Russia. So as a result, there was a rerun of the election where Viktor Yushchenko won. Was trust fooled then? Was trust Yes, our trust was betrayed then. But does it mean we should not have trusted? No, not quite. And so when you ask me about cultural memory and trust, I think that it's very important in our part of the world, in addition to the official version of history that often fluctuated along with the party line in terms of what can and what cannot be talked about. There was also family memory, unofficial memory, something we discussed in the kitchens. Not everybody had access to it, right? You had to know the passwords. You had to grow up. You had to ask the right questions. But there was a transmission of experience and values of a generation that had lived in the pre-Soviet time, and those who lived in the Soviet times, and those who had suffered the most and who thought it was unfair and had some ideas about how this could be corrected or how this could have been prevented or could be prevented in the future. So when we talk about trust, we often think, when we talk about trust, we think about blind trust. Whereas if you are trusting, you're completely vulnerable. But that's not the case. In a normal human coexistence, trust is a rational act. We decide to trust. In an atmosphere of trust, we act in a particular way, up to the first failure or to the first huge disappointment. The person can always retract their trust. And this is what our citizens often do, which is also doesn't serve us well, because sometimes, in addition for great change to occur, So it turns out that in order for us to be able to trust, we have to understand that we can also retract our trust, revoke our trust. It's not that we're necessarily the victim or that our trust is blind. And to me, the simplest formula of trust that I keep repeating is competence plus good intentions. So we're not giving a child to be operated on by a barber because a barber is not competent to be a surgeon. And we won't, or a hairdresser is not competent to be a surgeon. And so even if it happens that, a person has all the good intentions in the world, but they're not competent, and vice versa, we also know that you probably shouldn't elect a thief who is very competent because they have already proven that they abuse our trust. So if you don't have the good intentions, all the competence in the world won't help you. And so this is a very important formula for all of the traumatized post-Soviet societies like ours, because if these parameters aren't set, then people think that no fair play of any kind is possible on principle. And then just the final reflection on this, thinking out loud, on our empathy. Empathy is necessary, is the sine qua non, both for trust and for believing. But empathy is not the sufficient conditions, because Trump's followers also used empathy, whereas Trump's political technologists abused our trust. So our sense, our ability to put on, to feel, to find ourselves in other people's shoes or understand other people's decisions that we disagree with, but we accept that people might make those decisions and have the right to make those decisions. That kind of empathy is very important. But in addition to the empathy, at some point, especially in a moment of crisis, you have to have concepts like as shame and responsibility. Some people might remember this from the 90s in the demonstrations prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was like the favorite word, hanьба, shame. But it quickly fell out of use, and that was not a good thing, because the concept of honor became, and the concept of social shame became meaningless. It was very important that in the 90s it was not okay to ask in public interview either politicians or state officials where did you get your money from, because everybody knew where the money came from. It's dishonest privatization, or прихватизация, right, from the прихватить in Russian, right, to seize, to grasp. And so yes, other countries don't have people as rich as ours because they don't have people as poor as our country does. So our society and societies around us allowed this oligarchization to happen. They allowed these non-competitive mechanisms in economy because the concept of honor and shame stopped functioning for a time. And it's very important to me that after the Maidan, after the Revolution of Dignity, my students started asking their parents, Mom, Dad, where did our money come from? And I know cases where people refused to use the goods of their life, of their families, the resources of their families, and started their life anew because they had suspicions, and they proved to be true about where this money had come from. So there's this aspect of openness in society that's very important. And the next step, and I think this is the most important step, is the step of responsibility. Because I'm often asked, how can you be responsible for historical crimes if it didn't even happen in our historical time? Or how can you be held responsible for your community if I don't agree with these decisions and I wasn't part of this or that stupid thing? And I want to say, it turns out, and we see this in advanced societies, developed societies, how this happens in the pandemic. Some people say that nothing good is happening, vaccination is a conspiracy, there's no reason to wear a mask, and at the same time they think that when they're under threat, somebody will save them, and that our social solidarity will be such that we will be able to provide support for them, even though these separate people aren't going to support anyone. And so in each society, we were talking about for a long time, the two Ukraines was a huge trope. But I think that in every society there are two communities: the community that takes responsibility and the community that does not take responsibility. And you cannot expect that the community that takes responsibility will be the smaller community. Usually it is the larger community. It is that 73% or even more. Nevertheless, the welfare, the well-being of the entire community depends on whether or not there are people, there are groups, there are communities, there are circles, whether there are articulated ideas of the fact that that we can and must take on responsibility. Responsibility allows us to call a crime a crime. Responsibility allows us to shame those who are responsible. It allows us to reach procedures of reprieve, including illegal, and it helps us make the situation right and prevent it in the future. If we learn these mechanisms, if we learn to implement these mechanisms well, then it will turn out that the responsible citizens will have the sense, the feeling that they affect their future and their community. When students ask us, well, what do we do? We're tired, everyone's disappointment. Probably everybody will leave Ukraine soon. I almost always say, we're a free country. That's why we fought, so that you have the right to leave. But know that 10 or 20 years later, you might feel a connection to this country. You might want to come back. Or maybe even at a distance, you might want to be citizens and affect the future of this country, at least as a voter. Then this country will change even without you, because of course its fate will be decided by those who live here, because democracy doesn't really work at a distance. So the injustice is that I will say, and I won't even hear what people will respond, because I have to leave, and I'm very sorry. But I wanted to say that in spite of the fact, I wanted to respond to two things. One is that, in spite of the fact that democracy doesn't work at a distance, doesn't work as a remote, it can give very good distance impulses, like in Moldova now, for instance, thanks to votes by the people who... Right, Vakhtang was saying about this. People who have been working abroad, it came back. But I wanted to talk about a unique phenomenon that I saw in Ukraine. I'm sure it probably exists in other societies, but I haven't been able to find an analogous situation. How does Ukrainian society operates, uses trust in this kind of very capable way? At the moment of proclamation of independence, we had this window. For proclaiming independence. It was about 1 day long. And in 91, we managed to get in, to catch that train. You had about 1 day when you had the consolidated political will of all the groups to proclaim independence, and they did so. Now, when you analyze, if you look, had it not been the 24th, had it been the 25th, it wouldn't have been, 246, 4 and 1 against. But it would have been maybe 146 and 100 against. No, but they came up with the referendum. Right. But the question is, because so quickly, so rapidly, independence was proclaimed so rapidly, there was no rethinking, recalibration of the social contract. Because usually society grows into a new social contract, then that finds its expression in the new relationships between the state and the citizen, and then there's an independence or a new republic or whatever. But here, independence was proclaimed, but the social contract remained as it had been. And then, together with that social contract, we have the old roles. And the role of the state is not the role of a service mechanism, but role of a threat. It's on the one hand somebody who feeds you, but on the other hand someone who destroys you. And so what did Ukrainian society do at this point? It started using the category of institutional trust. Like if you go out in the street and ask someone what institutional trust is in the street, what that means, they won't be able to tell you. But people started using institutional trust as an instrument of checking the power, the abilities of power. When the balance of trust is low, is negative, For instance, the Ukrainian parliament has a traditional level of trust about 9 to 12%. Like, it's not governable. You can't govern a country. You can't even set an agenda if your level of trust is 9 to 12%. You put something on an agenda, and so what happens? You, by taking away that level of trust, society put itself in the position of safe security with regard to this particular threat. So society said, okay, we allow you to provide basic functions, because we need the electricity, water when you open the tap, the trains keep running, and etc., etc. We let you do that, but we do not let you do essentially any other categorical steps with regard to us, which is why we will counteract any attempt to establish strong authority until the balance has changed, when authority can become accountable. The category of accountability is a category that we had not reached yet. It's something that we're only achieving. The reform of decentralization is helping this, but we're not there yet. Where, first there's going to be feudal separation, then there's accountability. That's how that works. So this ability, by taking away the institutional trust to weaken the state, has largely saved us from autocracy. It has largely provided or strengthened pluralism. And it's very important to understand that the oligarchy was not because there was like a bad Kuchma who came up with a bad system, but because there was not enough security. Let me explain. We did what Pakistan did. Pakistan, little Pakistan, next to huge India, wrote in the Taliban into its national security. So India, if you want to swallow us, you get the Taliban along with us. And that's for forever. This will be a long-term problem. What did Ukraine do? Ukraine essentially entrusted a significant chunk of its national security to the pluralism of oligarchs. Without the ability to create strong institutions, these functions were then privatized. But that's how we survived as a state for the first 15 or 20 most vulnerable years of our existence. And so we have to understand that those things that were killing us are also the reason why we're alive, why we're here. So these are just remarks on, not really counteracting not really objecting to your conclusions, but just filling in the picture. And how difficult it is to put this into English. Well, things are not that difficult and things are not that new, and even in English. No. Well, I would, because I don't think these things are as unique. I think if we read the eighth book of Plato's Republic, I feel intuitively that in the last few years I have the sense that I have to reread the eighth book of Plato's Republic, where in Old Greek that is translated into into all languages. When you read this, it seems like that it has to do with us, because where does the degradation of society begins? It begins with democracy. With democracy, where glory is the highest glory, and then with oligarchy, where it's riches, where it's democracy, where it's freedom, and then it's tyranny, where the greatest virtue is power. You apply this to what happened in our country, and we have this linguistic toolbox. I'm sure that the translators will have that as well. Sorry, I have to leave now. Unfortunately, we have to say goodbye to Mr. Hlibovytsky, who is participating in the Lviv Media Forum. But nevertheless, we'd like to thank him for finding the time and showing up. I think if you have very important questions, we'll be able to get them together and address them to Yevhen, and maybe even get a response or a comment. But anyway, we'll continue our conversation now. As three participants, and together with you, I have some important questions that I would like to address, and then in a little time I will ask you to join this conversation. And we also have online listeners, people tuning in from the online will be gathering their questions as well. And then Bogdan will convey them to us, and hopefully we'll be able to get them involved as well. So I have, we talk a lot about faith, trust, belief, political trust, and it seems like this is a very clear historical and social measure of, and territorially of our state or of our history. But it seems to me that it's very important for kind of self-reflection and understanding. I really hope that to our partners who came here, this is also important to hear and understand, and perhaps reflect and understand more about this part of the world. However, I have similar questions again about faith and trust, as Yevhen said, about the things that didn't kill us made us stronger. I had this sense as well when we describe these processes, they rather arise in opposition to something rather than thanks to something. So we exist at the boundary of some paradoxes. And so faith, belief is something that I would like to come back to. It seems to be a fairly paradoxical thing, because many people said that, faith, if we believe, we don't have to doubt. In many religions, there's this concept: if we believe, then our faith must not have doubt. And it seems to me that the more closed a particular community is, the less doubt is allowed or encouraged. And so in this sense, I will come back maybe to our topic of a subject of belief and trust in our community that we exist in. So today, we live in a time of democracy or developing democracy, whatever, and we have the right to question everything. And sometimes this leads us to denying everything, and in opening, we heard this, what modern society can be like. And I would like to address then the question to you: do we? It's probably utopian to think that we can live in a society without belief, without faith, or when you start thinking about that, and the denial of the modern society with the denial of truth and the denial of faith, what scenarios do you see for the development of and the existence of a society of this kind? Is it possible even? Who is it for? I'd probably start with you, but if you could each reflect on that, it'd be great. Well, maybe it seems to me that, Volensnolas will return to the roots of our statehood, to the 1990s, and we try to add perspectives. And I would like to add additional perspective to this. Pani Iryna talked about the unjust privatization that gave birth to this lack of trust and faith and solidarity and belief in solidarity. But I would problematize the situation with this. You see, the thing is that, which is also unclear perhaps to outside observers, the fact that stealing from the state is not a crime. Sometimes it's even an achievement, a feat. Something we have from the Soviet Union. Why? Because the state was the main criminal. Because the bloody group of criminals, the Central Committee of the Communist Party. What was the GKCP coup. It was an attempt by the party elites to return the fullness of power into their hands. And so who was the main that's the crazy thing. Well, who was the main enemy of the Soviet power? It was the criminals, the cons. It's very strange. The cons, the complex of Robin Hood. The cons believed that they were doing they were doing just work. And so these criminal groups that we think about, these gangs, they see it. They saw their works as doing righteous work. They're robbing the criminal state. Yes, it's the money of the Bolsheviks, but it's the 90s. It was seen as a criminal state. It was falling apart. We didn't know where we're going. We didn't know it was all coming, whether or not it was going to come back. Who knew that that independence would last? And so the people who formed this balance in the 90s, some of them died, some were killed, someone escaped, someone became an oligarch, someone became an official or a politician. But I'm sure that they had those mechanisms of legitimation. What are they doing? They're not just robbing anyone, they're robbing a criminal state. They're Robin Hoods. And it's not entirely a lie, right? There is some grain of truth, even if it's like a twisted truth and their own truth. So the situation becomes even more complicated then. As for this question of society with trust or society without trust, well, without trust, without trust, I don't think society is possible without trust. It falls apart, it atomizes, and we have this experience. And then the important question is, how do we support that trust? And here I will agree with all the other speakers that trust has to be rationally backed up. This is something that concerns me, and so which is why Yevhen Hlibovytsky as a presentation resonated, because faith, it has to be trust. It can't be blind. It has to be rationally grounded. And this is also one of the threats of the modern world. The threat of Islamic fundamentalism and the threat of... By the way, why do we feel the way we feel about the Russian Orthodox Church? Right? Well, we're all Orthodox, right? Okay, most of us. But what the hell? Okay, they're Orthodox brothers, the same denomination. But we understand very well that the Russian Orthodox Church is not really about Christianity, not really about church, not really about faith, not really about God or solidarity. It's simply about external influence on us. For me, the Russian Orthodox Church is a branch of the FSB or the KGB, or perhaps the KGB is a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't know. So, but really, what Yevhen says, or Islam, fundamentalist Islam, I would like, on the one hand, it would be nice, what I put in my in my presentation, faith, trust, belief. It would be nice to see some kind of harmony in that. But in the modern world, unfortunately, sometimes faith is a challenge for trust. The kind of blind religious faith is a challenge to rationally motivated trust, that it corrupts trust or discredits trust. Yeah. And that is also, belief. And how do we proceed as a society that hadn't had this long history? Like Yevhen talked about, yes, our historical experience is different, and that the church hasn't perpetrated the same horrible crimes as others. But in the same way, it's always difficult for me to explain to my Western colleagues why we hate the left so much, particularly the communists. Well, it's not clear to the Westerners because the communists did not perpetrate these kinds of crimes as the Nazis had. But here it was the opposite. The presence of the Nazis was external. It came and left, whereas the communists were here for 70 years. We have different optics, which is why we have every reason to understand that the left idea is the same kind of evil as the right. The left ideas or the communist idea? No, leftist ideas. Because, okay, if we take all the leftist movements, it's very dangerous. We're moving into different territories. But if we take all of the leftist movements, sooner or later we came back to Marx. And Marx is evil. So Marx is equal to Gulag. This is the paradox. In this territory, Marx has turned into evil. Yes, it so happened. It's not that I want to. I wouldn't like to say this, but I have to, because we have this historically. And it's not just, a bad Lenin or a bad Stalin who have misinterpreted Marx, which Berdyaev writes. It's not just some kind of evil Russian priests, lying or distorting holy Christianity, holy Christendom. This kind of how it happened. It's the same thing with Catholic Church, with this belief in Christ and belief in God as love, kind of turned into Inquisition, the Crusades. I mean, there is that horrible historical truth in it. And the problem, to me, it seems, the problem in our understanding between us, those who lived in Soviet and the Russian Empire, and our neighbors, is that we have a different historical experience, both the experience of faith and experience of trust and belief. And so how do we move on? What do we rely on? What experience? This, we have to be really comfortable. We have to be really careful. We have to be selective about what we take on from this baggage and carry it on with us, and what we completely reject. And the problem is, what I'm talking about is, it's very difficult for me in an audience, a mixed audience, an international audience, to find things that are clear, even on an emotional level. Here's just an example. By the way, this also has to do with faith and religious belief. A friend of mine once told me, by the way, Yevhen Hlibovytsky, I think there was two of them together. I don't remember who said it. It doesn't matter. This was in Paris, and they were talking about the Ukrainian East. And they were sensing that they're losing the audience, that the audience no longer cares. And then one of them, maybe Yevhen, I don't know, one of them says, okay, do you understand what's happening in the Donbass? It's the Orthodox jihad. I mean, that makes no sense. How can jihad be Orthodox? Jihad is fundamentalist, is Islam, fundamentalist Islam. Orthodoxy is something different. But the French immediately, because to them, this hurts, this Islamic fundamentalism, terrorist acts, they begin to talking, well, that's not possible, but at least they came back online, right? They turned on, they started hearing this. But on the same level as there's a different optics of negative optics, there's also a difference in positive optics. For instance, if we talk about solidarity, about trust, about, let's say the unity between different denominations, I think we have a very good experience in Ukraine of union, not just between different denominations, which, by the way, also was a very strong thing in our life, where at least two of the Orthodox churches of Ukraine united. But we have, what I also sense in the conversation with French intellectuals, sometimes you hear from them that one of the biggest threats is Islam. And I understand why in France you might hear that. But what do we say to that? Well, I'm sorry, it's the opposite, because the very important part of our national identity and national solidarity and the prerequisite for internal social trust are our Muslims, are our Crimean Tatars, who, due to some historical and political situation, became not just allies, but became, in my opinion, an integral part of the Ukrainian political nation. This is a paradox that we have to process and think about. How is it that essentially a Christian nation, a nation that arose around Christianity, what Yevhen was talking about. Most European nations arose around a particular denomination, and usually a Christian one. Today we have to integrate into our solidarity, into our identity, political identity, we have to integrate Crimean Tatars, because along with us they counteract Russian aggression. By the way, and this doesn't date back to 2014, because Mustafa Dzhemilev was in Soviet concentration camps precisely because he was a Crimean Tatar, and he supported that movement. So I mean, I don't have an answer, like I said, but as far as our specific solidarity is concerned here, and our attempts within our Ukrainian political identity to find trust and faith, we have to understand that we are relying on a very particular experience that is there for our society and for our history, but that is difficult to translate into the languages of even our nearest neighbors. And then we emerge into the macro level, because we can't really expect to find our internal solidarity, our internal integration, without integrating with the European space. Because I have no doubt that Ukraine's path is a European path. I don't think there's a third path. I think that's also a mistaken belief that we're somewhere between Russia and Europe. If we are part of an integrated, organic part of Europe, that's how we preserve our political nationhood, our freedom, our system of values that allows us to survive and thrive. And so, to conclude, we have to look for this vocabulary that like Yevhen said, I will say things that are so difficult, that are very difficult to translate. And that's not because we don't lack the words, it's because the context is different, the history is different, the semantic field is different. And I really value this experience, what you do in terms of these verbal but also extraverbal practices. I think that one of the missions of this project is to find these joint semantic, aesthetic, historical fields where we begin to understand each other, hear and understand each other. Yes, you've probably wanted to react. I would just maybe just to build a quick bridge to you. So just to recall that, yes, we have people with different religious backgrounds and perhaps non-religious backgrounds, people from different countries, and who, I mean, something unites us with them as well and keeps us together. It's that trust for each other, that we'll be able to do something together and build something together. It'll be very interesting to hear reflections or questions from the people who came today from other countries. Because these questions are probably very clear to us, after 2014, or in our society, we address these questions to ourselves and return. What questions or objections perhaps it causes for you. But to come back to Pani Svitlana, because I remembered you had something to say, and then I'll probably open the floor for discussion. So I wanted to come back to your question that you said, what scenarios might happen for our society, and if we operate the metaphor of homo homini lupus est, when we talk about belief and trust in society, in Ukrainian society, that description is not total. It's just that these circles of trust, where people can rely on trust, they're limited by family, maybe extended family, but it's the family circle. I mean, maybe it's the extended family, like friends and family, but beyond that circle of trust, You have outsiders, and we don't trust outsiders. And so you have this very clear separation of we trust our own, but we don't trust the outsiders. And our own are few, and outsiders are many. And these scenarios can develop in a twofold. Either these circles of trust in which we include anyone who might seem like our own, so we broaden these circles of trust, we extend these circles of trust, or vice versa, we narrow them down, we make them ever more hermetic. And what might affect our choice of a particular scenario? By the way, they might change. We might alternate between the two. First of all, the question is, will we be able to close this lack of security? Probably not. I mean, obviously, if we do, then we'll be able to extend these circles. But the other path is, the thing is, okay, the psychological point of trust, I think, is the ability to delegate part of our adulthood, of our responsibility, to delegate it to another person. So trusting someone like ourselves is like seeing another person like a representative of ourselves. So psychologically, it's I guess it's identification. So we can perceive another person as, if we can perceive another person as similar to ourselves, then we can trust. If not, then not. And that's the only way to act with trust. We don't have to be, absolutist in this sphere. We don't have to destroy relations with a person as soon as they have violated our trust. Today we're talking about how we can't trust because their trust has been violated, has been repeatedly violated, has been repeatedly betrayed. We can't trust, and if we can't trust, then we can't build relations, which is not exactly true. We can build relations with other people even when we lack trust. Relations doesn't rule out relations as such. It just decreases psychological energy, psychic energy that we have to provide in order to build those relations with a person who might be completely negative, that might totally function even if our trust is not total. So the skill to build productive, mutually beneficial relations in situations of lack of trust means a return of that part of adulthood that we want to delegate to another person. And so if as a society we can grow, we can develop these skills in ourselves to build relations in the conditions of lack of trust, then we'll have a scenario of greater trust. And that's the extent of what I had to say. I don't know, it seems like you've been living with that all the time, and we continue learning to do this. You seem that you want, it seemed, Iryna, that you had something to say, and maybe then I'll just open the floor. So unfortunately, I have to say that it's not just Yevhen Hlibovytsky has left you, but I will have to leave you as well in 5 minutes. Yeah, and so just a final phrase, and then I'll gather all the questions, and then I've talked about this with Bożena, that if there is need to do this, I will be happy to respond to them in writing or in other opportunities of this project. We will see you to discuss all that was not discussed. But I will just, to conclude, I will say that when we talk about security, we think about, most of all, we think about the future. We think about how much future we have ahead of us and whether it's good or not, prosperous or not. So as far as this is concerned, relations of trust, mutual trust and mutual respect and recognition are most easily built where we have a large expanse of future. When it so happens, and this happens in Ukrainian society, that some small group of general community questions the necessity and the possibility for the existence of this community, that's a completely different level of relationships. dialogue or psychologically difficult relationships with people you don't trust are possible if the other side does not want to destroy you. If actually what they want is for you not to exist or for your values to be completely destroyed, then even great psychological cost will make it not just impossible, but even unwise to maintain dialogue. However, we're almost certain that all wars come to an end. I mean, so far in human history, all wars came to an end. And we hope that many of the wars that persist today on Earth, one of which is in Ukraine, and also in frozen states, some of them in the territory of Europe, that these wars will too will come to an end. And that is when, that is what we're working for. That is why we defend ourselves. That is why we're developing all these different scenarios. What will happen once we are in one country with people who are completely different from us? And the example of Crimean Tatars was extremely important here, extremely apt, because, for instance, in our society, when we're told that we're too homogenous, which in many cases we are a very homogenous society, but then the fact that we have Crimean Tatars within the Ukrainian political nation suddenly makes us a more complicated organism, a more complicated society for cooperation and even for self-narration. Who are we? What are we? What are our identity markers? What is our history? And where are we going with this history? And at this point, it's very important to take the dimension of other humanism, right? As pronounced by Bart Nottebohm, you can Google it later. What is he talking about? That up to now, humanism, whether in Enlightenment or Romanticism, usually had to do with people like us, people that we can trust completely, right? People who are part of our identity, who are part of us, who are like us, people who are part of our common project where we are authors or co-authors. What happens when we have more co-authors? And then this very important question that Vakhtang directly signaled. I tried to be a little bit more oblique. There's a balance of trust and doubt, right? The testing question. What can we do? What can we do in these communities that are not common, but that wish to live together and that want to have a common circle of security? What is the place? What is the future that we have reserved for the people who think not like us, who believe differently from us, or who perhaps don't believe at all? But in that case, only in that case, this commonality will only develop, and it has to understand that all of it is dynamic. Even how we talk about our belief or our lack of belief, and what we can agree on believing, all of this is a snapshot of how we think now, of what we're like now, and where we're looking now, and thinking about our future. And it's clear that this will change, and this means that we have to put that change, work that in, and work on change has to be part of it, because these changes cannot be independent. It cannot happen without us. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting conversation, very intense and very exhausting too, because in this moment, specifically in this moment, in this space, yes, we were in a circle of security, but as soon as we leave, we will understand what sort of fatal dangers we have to work with and will have to work with. Thank you. Thank you. On that note, thank you very much. I would like to open the floor to questions. I really hope that, I know we're missing two speakers, but I'm sure that we'll nevertheless be able to deal with this massive questions that we'll be able to hear now. So questions from the audience. Are there, what would you like to ask, clarify? Perhaps you have objections, add a comment to a particular thesis that has been voiced so far. We have two, right? So thank you for this conversation. It was very interesting to listen about faith, belief, and trust. This was interesting. I would like to go back to faith, from trust to faith, because in discussion we were talking about trust the most, and I tried to, translate this from the American dollar, in God we trust, literally. If we take inside, then suddenly we understand that we have to believe in God, and then united with this faith in God, we trust. We trust in people who are like us. But I also read this phrase today as these trust, because of course within the pro-vaxxers or anti-vaxxers we believe people who are like us. And so the question to the philosopher and the psychologist, God is bigger than the social bubble, right? But often we understand that God that is divided into 1,000 identical or much smaller gods or deities doesn't work in the various challenges of the 21st century. So in what do we trust? What can unite us that we may all trust in? I think, as any philosophical question, there's also a question, right? Humanity, ultimately, it's this new humanism or old humanism that we can, if we practice, what does not, if we do not destroy the condition for the existence of humanity in general, then sure, there may be different practices, but if these practices do not destroy the possibility of our existence as such, as a biological species, then we can live with it. And we can build institutions on it, trust, and ultimately, perhaps the first work in the history of our civilization that was talking about that, not only about that, but approaches that, is Kant's work for eternal peace, zum ewigen Frieden. And what is Kant talking about? You understand? There's a play of words, right? The Friedhof in German means cemetery, and so eternal peace implies a cemetery. And so what does Kant say? What is the possible future of humanity? There are two options. Either you have a total Friedhof, a total cemetery where we simply destroy humanity, or it is a unification of everyone. And Kant writes this in the late 18th century, where there aren't even political nations yet in the sense, at least the German political nation doesn't exist yet. Kant's already talking about how the future of humanity is possible either as a cemetery, either we all perish, or we all unite. All the nations, all the peoples. And what does Kant say into Eternal Peace? It's a very relevant work now, because Kant understands that war is unavoidable in the modern world for him and to us. There are always wars. But what does Kant say? Kant ultimately says in this work, he says that he writes of the possible conditions of conventional war. If Kant says, okay, war exists, evil exists, we can't avoid that, but how do these horrible practices, relying on, how do we rest them on such principles that would later not lead to the impossibility of our very existence? And he writes, what is it not possible to do during a war? What we may not do? What practices must be completely forbidden? For why? For the fact that once we emerge from this state of war, we will have to live together. That we have that opportunity. And that's this very optimistic scenario. But what we run into in the real world, are all prepared to hold to this, because it's not even a question that of, let's say, there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, or whatever, in Syria or Afghanistan. The question is, there are certain forces that don't want to rely on these principles of the possibility of the survival of humanity in general. They don't care for different reasons, maybe for religious reasons, because they believe that through war crimes they will end up in paradise or whatever, or and it's not about, to them it's not about the survival of us as a species, as humanity. And then what do you do then? Then it's not clear how we build that solidarity. And that's when I'd like to add this add this to what Pani Iryna said. Yes, I also work as a phenomenologist. This is something out of phenomenology, right? The concept of der Fremde, the stranger, by Weidenfels, and here's this humanistic interpretation where other doesn't mean enemy. We have to see other as, this is someone else. He's different religion, different language, might even have different values and different principles of life that are not in agreement with mine, but I have to see them not as an enemy, but as an other, and therefore interesting and complementary, that might be complementary to my kind of life and my existence. This is a very important problem for us. Well, what if this other sees everything other as an enemy that needs to be destroyed? This is a problem that we cannot explain. The problem of our war in Russia and Ukraine is not that Russians want to conquer us. It's that they want us to not exist. Not physically. It's that they don't want this country to exist. They don't want this identity to exist. They don't want this language, these coordinates to exist. Physically, they're completely fine to accept us as part of one nation, one state. Fine, sure, live. This is what I call this so-called inclusive Nazism, right? Classic Nazi is exclusive, right? Non-Aryan races must be physically destroyed, and then Aryans will be happy. It's horrible, it's cynical, but that's why it's lost. Whereas this kind of inclusive Nazism, it's more terrifying. Yes, we leave you the chance to survive, but only if you refuse your own identity, reject your own identity, history, culture, language, way of life, everything that matters to you. If you completely dissolve in this identity that we impose on you. And what do we do with that? I'm not sure. I don't have a recipe. I don't have a. So when it's a very difficult situation, because it's not when something comes that wants to destroy you or conquer you, but something that wants to dissolve you. Not destroy you maybe even physically, but destroy you existentially and culturally. But we're people. We're not just living beings. It's not just living. It's not just survival. It's something else. And what do we do with this? This is an important challenge that exists in the modern world. And by the way, I'm not a professional here. This is not my. I think the logic of jihad is the same. In jihad, war, physical destruction is only the last tool. The main point is to dissolve everybody in the ummah, make everybody homogeneous, to the extent that that they should be. I think this is very threatening. What I call inclusive Nazism. This is a very threatening practice in modern world, because in any case it leads to totalitarianism that are not compatible with humanism and the survival of humanity as such. But another threat that seems only purely technological today, right? When we talk about your question, well, what can we unite in? What do we trust in? Well, in God, but there's too many little gods. Some other informational bullets, bubbles. Okay, well, let's stretch the information bubble for the entire to enclose the entire humanity, and then we'll be happy. But then, what is the threat? The threat is post-humanism. what we already talked, that we've already integrated our gadgets into our existence. Where is this line? When we it's not just our difference from animals, but it's now our separation, our difference from our tools. And now questions arise, well, how should we think of artificial intelligence? Should we impose moral regulations, extend moral regulations to artificial intelligence? And there are fantasy movies about this. I don't know, because so far, thankfully, I think that our generation will not encounter this problem. But quite possibly in 50 or 100 years, this will be a real problem. Let's say a robot. It's a creature, right? Are they part of the sphere of moral regulation or not, or some other, absolutely some other events? This is a very interesting bridge to an important question that was there, and through several presentations that we were talking about what complicates our life today, these social media, internet, and the presence of these social bubbles, the possibility of manipulation that have allowed us, in being in any part of the world, to create some kind of group or bubble that believes in something and control it, and to manage and to rule it. We have interesting examples from the United States, right? When these when conspiracy theorists arose in different states and even outside the United States, who united around a particular theory. And you mentioned the existence of post-humanism, where there's a question of ethics, and the ethics about artificial intelligence, about our existence in the time of this post-truth and this complete accessibility. We can get any information, but what can we believe in? And I guess I would like to perhaps address the question to you, Pani Svitlana. You mentioned conspiracy theories. You mentioned the existence of those social bubbles. Today, when we have the opportunity to create some kind of new god or create some belief in something new, and we don't only have the people who are around us in our state. We can do this. We can sit here and unite with whoever wants to talk to us or go along with us. What examples or filters would you suggest, and what can we do today? And this then adds the added complexity of life in an age of the internet, of accessible media, and very often perhaps the possibility to manipulate the people who have those resources. We have many world and Ukrainian examples. Do you have some kind of model or filters of how can we understand, filter? What can we do? How can we find this truth? So I don't love these questions because I don't know. I don't have an answer to it. I don't know how to counteract the manipulative influence, kind of digitalized, omnipresent influences that are there, that enter your life all the time. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, but I'll come back to that part where you talk about coming up with a new god, and to your question about, well, what do we believe in? What are we supposed to believe in to unite? And I'm sorry, my instinct as a psychologist forced me to theorize your question. I hear a bigger question in there, a larger question in there. Can we what I'm hearing you ask is, can we interact peacefully or regulate conflicts if we do not, do we need, is a future possible if we don't all belong to the same community? Is a future possible if we all exist in different social bubbles? Perhaps we will need a new God that will unite us into some kind of social bubble. Is this the only way that we can continue existing? And I think that, I mean, we don't have to believe in some. The problem is that, as I think Yevhen said, our natural state is chaos. And if we want to reach something, decay, well, chaos too. But if we want to achieve something, we have to apply ourselves. We have to put an effort. It's the same thing with God, you know, to an extent. In addition to everything else that God provides, is consolation, hope, salvation. God's provide the sense of moral rightness in the conflicts and discussions that we have. Right? We can't live without conflicts. We'll constantly be conflicting, as me and you, I and thou, as we and you. God is this kind of moral support, so to speak, moral pillar, moral crutch, so to speak, that we use to give weight to our position. And in your question, there is some truth that the way I hear it. Is there an absolute truth that gives us this moral rightness, that the progress, so that the progress in whose path we walk as humanity, as civilization, is precisely in the fact that we internalize God, so we appropriate God's property to seek moral rightness in ourselves, and to communicate with others who are not like us, who are not part of our social bubble, who belong to other circles, who embody otherness, how to communicate with them when our rightness is equal and neither has the upper hand. Can we communicate then? And so, coming back to what Vakhtang said, when we communicate with someone who wants to destroy us, well, first of all, Talib and jihad and the Putin regime right now is precisely the example of the inability to communicate with those who are different from you. You can either incorporate this other, right, annul the otherness, or destroy it. It's this not really civilized approach to sociality. And if we're dealing with those kind of partners, I mean, you have to fight. There isn't much for it. You have to fight back. You have to defend yourself and fight for your life. But fortunately, our social life is not limited to such countries. Just a brief remark here. I know that she's the psychologist, but I'll be the psychologist here. How do we completely resist these? How do we resist these influences? We recognize them. We recognize that we're completely, that we constantly under influence by something. So, just as an example, I have a friend who is not a philosopher. He's this very practical and very opportunistic practitioner. But he has these ideas, at one point he came to see me and he said, okay, you have to recognize that there is a world conspiracy. And I said, yes, there is, and you're part of it. Right. I saw a question at the very end, Bogdan. Yeah, and then there was another one. Then you were next, and then I think there was a third hand I didn't quite catch. Hi. So I have nothing to do with information technology. So I wanted to just add as to this question about how to not let these bubbles filled with fake information. How do we preclude these bubbles from having undue influence? I think it's institutional control. I think it's the responsibility to the media that share this information. right? Facebook for a longer time rejected scenarios as rejected editors. So largely, a lot of people statistically are taking their information from social media and rejecting responsibility as an editor for Facebook. That is unacceptable, because as an example, when the radio showed up, there was an example in New York City where they started reading a fantasy story about aliens attacking, and people started panicking because nobody said that this isn't news, this is a fantasy story that's being read. The same way, it says, oh, we found a new way of communicating, it's social media, but we haven't learned to use it and control. Let's say that we can't disseminate this information because eventually you get Pizzagate or other things where people simply do silly things because a particular information was leaked publicly and nobody wants to control it because it is not financially beneficial. So I think we as people, as institutions, we have to participate in this and minimize these harmful influences. I think that's the only thing I wanted to add. So I have a quick response here. I'd agree, but there's an internal inconsistency here, because it's not for nothing that social media are called the fifth power as opposed to the fourth power, the journalists, the media. So they're somehow different. So in your remark, if you don't identify it, at least you compare them. Radio, television, papers, newspapers, and the social media. But the thing is, what is the pathos of social media? It's the absolute free circulation of any information. And so any attempt to control that information will already be perceived as censorship in a space that free. And that's the internal inconsistency, because essentially any mass media forum, whether a newspaper or radio or television, they honestly say, yes, we have a editing policy, we have our own agenda, we have our views, and according to this, we, if not censor, then at least we select materials. Yes, we fact check, but we fact check them this way and this way. So there is a editing policy. But social media doesn't have that. It's a completely free circulation, right? It's freedom as such. It's freedom par excellence. It's the pathos of absolute freedom, of absolute independence. And that's when we start saying, wait, but let's control that. Let's limit that. Then to an extent, you can run into the argument, well, what do you mean? You're curtailing freedoms. This is some kind of totalitarian, authoritarian practices, because we don't have, unlike classical media, you don't have a responsible body that says, yes, I'm on the editing board of several journals. This is me. I say, well, this is our policy. We don't accept these materials, not because they're bad, but because they're not for us. Whereas in social media, how can you do that technically? I'm not sure that it won't destroy the idea of social media. I have a question for Bogdan as a philosopher. We talk about a lot faith, trust, doubt, and this balance that might lead, it has led to indifference and nihilism. So to me, the question of values arises here. We were talking about a value that might unite all of humanity, right? It's the value of preserving nature, right? Nature is the ecologists right now are sounding the alarm. It's not just a fantasy; it truly is. I think this is a well-informed audience that this is the most frightening threat for humanity. Not wars, not all of these conflicts, but it's this preservation of the planet. That's the central question that might unite us all on the planet Earth. Do you agree with this as a philosopher, Vakhtang? And also, because I'm not gonna ask for the microphone again, but I really wanted to think about these ideas and these discussions. They're very important questions. But I think the central question that might unite humanity, and it'll be difficult, of course, but that would help humanity survive. Just because I wanted to remind us of Volodymyr Vernadsky, right? And this is not just him. It started with the French. Intelligence becomes a geological force, and this intelligence, if it is aimed, then the dilemma is, what is it aimed at? If it ends up in a circle of people who know what the planet is, how the planet functions, then humanity would not violate this this planet and destroy the planet and itself. But as we can see, human intelligence often does thinks and does bad things. So thank you for your answer. Well, thank you for that question. First of all, I hear the two keywords here is indifference and ecological problematics. Well, indifference is, I think, is also an element of communication, just like silence is an element of communication. Because if there wasn't silence and pause, there would be no communication or music. All of us who know how important music is understand the importance of pause in musical works. In theaters, I think everyone who's ever acted on stage understands how important it is or how difficult it is to hold that pause. It's a much more powerful actor's skill than speaking. So much like silence is part of communication, indifference is part of our communication. And moreover, I would say that in some situations it's even better than interest. In some situations, right? For instance, I would love it if Russians were indifferent to us. I don't want neither their friendly embrace nor their love nor passion. If they were simply indifferent to us at some point, it would be far easier for us. And there are multiple examples like this. That's as far as indifference is concerned. As far as ecology is concerned, okay, I'll take a long way around here. But so first of all, we have this insincerity in our mind. At first we believe ourselves to be too frail, too weak, too incapable, and then too threatening and too influential. What do I mean? When we say about the threat to the planet Earth, and I agree with these theories, with these views. I think we should be ecologically responsible. Moreover, I'll say when we talk about moral decay, I think it's a lie. I think because if we look at the development of morality, then I would say that moral regulation keeps extending. If we look, 1,000 years ago, which for history is nothing, then who was the object of moral regulation, even in Europe? As Yevhen said, it was adult, grown, white, educated men. Reality, I mean, truly, there were discussions in the Middle Ages. Does a woman have a soul? And then we extend this moral regulation to an ever wider circles of living beings. First, all humans, right? Like the concept of childhood itself arose in the late 19th century, because in the 19th century, people were seen as not quite human. So there was no problem of like child labor, because it's like, yeah, it's human, but not quite human yet. Okay, it dies, it survives. Today we talk about the protection of children and children's rights. Then we open this moral regulation to living nature, to animals. And then we say we have to include even non-living nature, right? The work by Meriabi, Aufstand für die Natur, Uprising for Nature, I think, he says that this Kant's categorical imperative that is applied only to people must be extended to nature, even as though nature itself is a subject, and even non-living nature such as mountains and rocks has to be included into moral regulation, and then extend that. Even our technical innovations, such as artificial intellect, is there subjectivity there, etc. But so yeah, there is some progress. I think there is moral progress. I think at least in our Western, transatlantic, European, whatever you call this civilization, I think it's progressing rather than degrading. Yes, with certain rollbacks like Nazism or communism, etc. But what surprises me here as a philosopher is, I'm sorry, is this not of this world? Was this not made by God? I mean, yes, we created this, but through our hands, this was created by nature. We are part of this world. We're not aliens. Not in the sense that we came in from space. I mean, space is this world too, because these things, the microphones, the cameras, the cell phones, the headsets, the computers, are also part of this world, something we generated in this world. And when we say that those instruments, those technologies that we generate can threaten the world, there is a certain inconsistency, because we take a lot on, that we can, as a product of this world, can put something on that can create something that will destroy this world. I think we're taking too much on, a bit too much on. We're claiming such power that we do not have on the one hand. But we did come up with the nuclear bomb. Okay, but this was already voiced today. It's not more threatening that, right? And then, as this already was said today, will the nuclear bomb destroy the world? No. I mean, also another clarification. I also remember when people talk about preserving life on the planet, I think about a work by Max Scheler, also a phenomenologist partly, that he wrote in 1928, and he died immediately after. It's called Die Stellung des Menschen im Kosmos, the position of man in space. This is way before any kind of cosmic exploration. And Scheler writes about that we are cosmic creations, we're cosmic creatures. Why? Because unlike all other animals, it's a whole other long conversation why, but we're universal creatures. We can survive anywhere where life is possible, not just on planet Earth, but also other planets in space. This is why we're concerned with this question of, is there life on Mars? Why are we interested whether there's life on Mars? Because we understand where life is possible, we can live. Yes, differently using technical means, but we could survive. And so we have to understand that we're universal cosmic creatures. And by the way, this gives us a totally different level of responsibility. We're not just responsible for our country, for our continent, and for our planet. Ultimately, we're responsible. We live in space, in the cosmos. And that's one question. And then finally, about ecology. Again, I agree with your fears. I share your fears. I share your concerns. I support this extension of moral regulation to nature and the world. However, in the modern world, we're threatened by other things as well. And I will say perhaps an unpopular thing, but sometimes I have to say it. I'm very afraid, I'm very scared of this. Manipulation is possible here, where our main goal is to save the planet as it is, support all these ecological movements, but do we not then face the threat of what I call ecological fascism? When, on behalf of the powers that supposedly want to save nature, they start, if not killing people, then certainly limit their possibility to continue dignified human existence. What am I talking about? Look, the problem of hunger hasn't been solved. There are countries where people are suffering from elementary lack of food. In a world like that, to say that we have to completely reject all technology that would allow us, for instance, to create enough food, even let's say it's bad food, even it's substandard food, even if it violates whatever biological cycles, but allows us to feed a large number of people to prevent them from dying from hunger. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, it's all connected. You
Yeah,
can't
of course.
look at it separately.
Of course.
Just the hunger,
Absolutely.
solve the hunger, and
Yeah, absolutely.
climate change.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. But I say
part
that
of the problem.
but the problem is more complicated.
Я дуже перепрошую,
Sorry,
зараз
I
є
would like to
перекладачі.
add also
Just a
something,
second.
and
You need to
there is no
microphone.
because there is no place to the discussion. So sorry for this
Yes, just a second.
rough interruption, but I think that there is some problem.
Pavel, just one second. Pavel, just a second.
sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I will let you speak just a second.
Sorry, because I'm nervous. There is no place to the
but
opinions.
it's important. I just wanted to say that if someone needs headphones of, because now it seems we are moving to speaking in English, right? We are a little bit behind the schedule, but I think it feels that it's very important that a lot of you would like to speak up, right? І чи вам буде комфортно, якщо ми будемо англійською розмовляти? Okay, so Pavel, I will let you speak.
Yes, because I have two fears after these lectures and during this discussion now. Maybe it's a kind of misunderstanding, but there were a lot of opinions, a lot of words about mistrust and about the things which lost in translation. For me, it's very important, and my second fear. So the first one is this about the translation, and the second one is connected because it's about this idea that there are a lot of questions without answers, and there are no answers for these questions. And I have to say that I really don't like the narration like this, that we can also raise the questions without the answers, because we have to remember that we are living in the world where prevailing populism, yes, is rising, and where very different kinds of fundamentalisms have good answers for everything and strong answers for everything, and so our main aim should be some kind of reaction for this. And for me, the reaction that we can raise the question, it's not exact reaction for this growing fundamentalism. What is important for me, and I do believe it's possible. Yes, I don't like this narration that it's difficult to translate our problems. I'm from Poland, and this post-communist heritage is also my heritage. Of course, it's probably a little bit different heritage than here in Ukraine. But for example, I'm always very angry when I speaking with Polish people about this heritage, and this heritage is kind of the shame in our society. Yes, so we try to imitate the West, imitate America, the Americanization in Polish society is really strong influence, yes, but and it's so strong shame about this post-communist heritage, and in my opinion, we should do our best to translate this heritage, this experience to other cultural perspectives, because we live, in global. Yes, we have a lot of global challenges now. Yes, and it's probably our main goal, and I believe it's possible in the frame of our project as well with 7 countries. Yes, to translate our experiences and to find some kind of answers, even if these answers will be blurred or inexact or unreasonable, etc. But we should try. Without discussion, it's impossible to change anything. So it's one because there is a lot of course things after this very intensive morning. The second thing, mostly connected with Yevgen's lectures. He is absent, so it's a pity, but I thought about the book written by American sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild. The title of the English title is "The Stranger in Their Own Country" or "In Their Own Land." I don't remember exact the title, and she writes about Tea Party supporters in America, and of course Trump supporters, and she made a lot of focus interviews with the citizens of the state Louisiana, which is one of the most polluted places in the earth. And she asked why you vote for Tea Party supporters, for Conservative Party, in case when they are against you. Yes, because they don't want to do nothing with this situation of the pollution. It's a very interesting book, but what is important for me, the final chapter of this book is about of this category mentioned by Iryna about empathy. And Arlie Russell Hochschild proposes something she calls deep history. That only in this level of deep histories we are able to discuss and to create some kind of common mutual sense and mutual area to talk. And I think at the theater we have this kind of space to create this deep history. And it's our main tool. I would like to believe it's possible to create the space like this against this lack of trust to the translations and to the answers.
Maybe I would like to suggest something, because we are really behind the agenda and schedule. Maybe if there are a few more reactions, I hope you will remember.
Probably very short.
Very short.
Very short reaction
Because
on
we
the
are
first.
really about to. Okay, very short.
On the first part of your statement, it's two statements here about translation and about the translation question. Yeah? I would say that we are always in the situation of the lost translation. I mean this name of this film of Sofia Coppola. Yeah? Lost in translation doesn't mean only the language. Yeah? It means our existential situation. even in the communication with our neighbors, relatives, friends, we are always lost in translation, and it's okay. So we can live with it. Yeah? We should live in this situation, and we should search every time, every day. We should search, and we should find these bridges. Yeah? That's why, and I absolutely agree with you about our past. We may and we must work with our past in humanities, in the arts, but because if we say if we don't do it, we legitimize the crimes of the past. But we cannot say that it's just a part of our history, that's why we should live with it. Yeah? For example, Nazi in Germany or communists in the Soviet Union. We should say that the Soviet communists were the criminals. And it's very important for our society now, in Ukraine and in Russia, etc.
But I think it's easy to say something like this in Ukrainian society.
It's not very easy. It's not very easy because the new people who didn't live in Soviet Union, they are not agree.
Because, for example, in Poland we have this problem that it's very easy to say, oh, Soviet Union, the criminals, Nazi Germans were the criminals. Only we, the Poles, are innocent, and it's we were always victims.
When I'm saying about the Soviet Union, I don't say the Russian communists. I say Soviet communists, because many Ukrainian people were the communists also, and they were the criminals for me. And about the question, I think that the best answer is the question. Yeah, and we can work with the fundamentalism in this asymmetrical manner. Yeah, because it's very dangerous to think that we can find the final solution and lose it. Yeah, it's very dangerous. So I think that in our discussion it's very important to find not the final solution and the answer, but we can and we should find search the new interesting questions. That is very important for our communication.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. I think we have to really maybe one, and there was one question or comment, and we have to really finalize our discussion. If there are no really urgent, or if you don't have anything really urgent to say, we will have after the lunch, we will have group works. Andrea, you will to say something. If you can be brief, okay? Yes. At the very end,
absolutely. In the very end, I'm just very happy that we also came to this point of talking about the global society, because for a long time we were talking about national communities, national history, etc. But this is also a project of transnational cooperation, and we were talking about the environment and the climate crisis and hunger, etc., etc. So I think there is a lot to talk about. How do we create trust, solidarity in a, let's say, global community beyond any national... Global challenges, because also idea of national state, national culture is a very young concept and might also disappear very soon, because it maybe will not help us to solve the situation we are in. So I'm very curious if we find an idea how belief and faith in a global society is possible.
Okay. You would like to?
No,
you would like to comment?
It's a good final statement for our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everyone. I thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for all of you that you stayed and you didn't leave. And thank you for contributing into this great. We raised a lot of questions. We covered a lot of subjects quite difficult for nowadays, for our society, for different societies. And I think we come with a really big number of questions, right, that we can answer by ourselves. We can try to answer them by ourselves, and we can go on with them. But still, after the lunch, we will have 5 groups. I will ask you to sign up. There are questions in this board behind you. There are 5 groups. And what really bothers you, what you want to discuss, there is still a chance to talk about that. We would really like to hear what you want to express. It's very important for us, your contribution. There will be 5 groups. If you want to create the 6th group, we also have a democratic approach here. You can create a 6th or 7th group.
Or one-person group.
No, one-person group, right. And if you want to talk about some not covered topic. So please do sign up, and there is an opportunity to discuss about that. And it's only our 2nd conference. After this conference is finished, all of us will be working in our countries with different international groups and creating theatrical projects, theatrical performances, covering actually the topic of faith. And you are very invited to visit us next year. We will have our own production, but also one visiting, at least one, I hope, visiting one of our partners' performances. So I know you will go on discussing, because there is a really, really many questions not covered and many opinions not expressed. Some of them will be covered in this afternoon. Thank you all, and you are all invited to continue discussing in our lunch. Thank you.